To another episode of Unfiltered Conversations. I'm your host, Tyler. Very happy to be here today with a very special guest to our show, Heather Cox Richardson. Thank you so much for taking the time today to join us on the Unfiltered Historian. The Unfiltered Conversations show that we do is really fun and laid back. We just get to sit here and talk history and talk a little bit about you. So that makes it kind of fun. But before I get started, I'd like for you to take a second. If you'd like to introduce yourself for those that may not know who you are, I'm pretty sure most folks tuning in today should know. But just in case they don't, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a historian. I do a lot of public facing work, although I also write academic books. But Tyler, aren't you going to tell people how we met?
Yeah, we should talk about that story because that
Cool
was so
story,
cool.
right?
It was awesome. So you guys know that I work at Manassas National Battlefield, which is a super awesome place, a very, very strong piece of hallowed ground that we have here, preserved by the wonderful National Park Service. Got to give them a little bit of love too. But I work in the bookstore, and I happen to have one of the rangers come in and be like, hey, there's someone out front you need to go meet. I'm like, oh, okay, I'll go do that. So I happened to be just on my lunch break too, so it was like perfect timing. And I walk out to the desk, and one of my really, really good friends, Steve, who's a volunteer at the park, is there working and doing his shindig at the volunteer desk there. And little did I know that Heather would be standing there at the front desk. And again, you guys know that I've worked on the Hill for a long time, so I've read her work prolifically when I was up there. I still read it today, so I was very starstruck. And I normally try not to do that because I don't want to be that guy. It's like, oh my god, I know who you are. But yeah, she was at the desk at Manassas. So you were on a trip to Virginia battlefields in different parts of the state, correct? I have that
Yeah,
right.
it was totally cool, I have to say. And we could talk some about that, but it was really cool because that
Yeah.
was our first, it wasn't our first place that we went, but it was the first that we really got to spend a whole day at. And of course, I knew so much about the different battles there, but I'd never been there.
So
And
that was your first time.
It's just different.
Awesome.
It's just different when you actually get to see how things are laid out and where people were,
Mhm.
and it just is a really different feel. And we actually went from there. We did a lot of stuff across Virginia. I'm happy to talk about, but we also saw
Would love to.
Antietam, which
Oh,
oh my,
ooh, that is my second favorite battlefield. It used to be my first, but that is
what's
absolutely my second
what's your
favorite.
first favorite?
I'm a little biased, but Chancellorsville. I live in the Fredericksburg region, so I got the four major battlefields any which way I turn out of my front door. So Chancellorsville, just because of the implications that has throughout, I mean, the entire Civil War. Stonewall Jackson's gone. Lee gets sort of, I like to say Lee gets a big head there and goes all the way up to Gettysburg. With what happens at Chancellorsville, he thinks his army's almost invincible. So there's a lot of really interesting things with that one. But I think Antietam's also on that same kind of wavelength where there's an utter shock to the country with what happened on one day in September. And it's hauntingly beautiful. I think that's probably the most apropos term for Antietam or description. I don't know if you took away the same thing, but when you get there, you can really just feel the power of that place.
Well, so it is very beautiful as just scenery,
Hmm.
yes, but you can also really tell where the different,
Yeah.
units were in a way that, Gettysburg, which I had
Mhm.
seen before, Gettysburg, because it goes on for so long and everybody gets mixed up together, basically, it's like, "Oh, yeah, they were all right
Right.
here," which is a little hard for you to understand. But, I have a question for you, and that's, I thought Antietam was extraordinarily powerful.
Hmm.
And then there's all these houses there, and they, like, literally built houses and are living in houses on the battlefield.
Hmm.
And then we went to Fredericksburg, which is even more so.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, they're like, literally, there are a whole bunch of houses right there where the troops were mowed down. And I said to my husband, "I don't think I could live in those
Mhm.
houses." What do you think?
Well, so when I worked as an intern at the park, I got to live right smack in the cemetery in one of those houses. So not only am I living in a cemetery, but I'm also living on Marie's Heights, which is obviously a pivotal part of the first Battle of Fredericksburg, and also the second Battle of Fredericksburg. The Federals actually take Marie's Heights on the second battle. So I did it. I always say my neighbors were quiet, of course, but it's also eerie. To know kind of where you're at and what happened there. And everybody's always just like, oh, it's a cemetery. That's creepy. I said, that's not necessarily what I'm thinking. I'm thinking that I'm living on a battlefield. So, yes, these people may be resting here, but this isn't a peaceful resting place like a cemetery might be in some town square, or even the Fredericksburg City Cemetery, that's also a battlefield. So you've got this weird, combination of it not only being a graveyard, but it also being a killing ground. And
That's
I
really
think, yeah,
that's really well put, because I don't have a problem with graveyards at all.
no, I love them. I think they're peaceful. But when you go to one that's, yes, it's a national cemetery, it's manicured, it looks great, but it's, again, it's that power of humans, Americans killed one another here.
Well, and for somebody my age, I'm in my
Mhm.
60s, and to recognize, especially at Antietam, because it starts so early, like,
Mhm.
these are to me, they're kids,
They are.
and with luck, they've gotten breakfast, or at least coffee into them before they start across that field, and you just think, I don't know if this is gonna be clear, but you think about the difference between that cup of coffee and the cornfield, and you just think it was a matter of
It
minutes.
was. And that, yeah, the Texans, they had that, they haven't eaten for days. And some of them are even in the process of cooking when the orders go to march to that cornfield. So you can imagine, like, you're malnourished, but you're so dedicated to your cause that you're willing to take unfried dough that's around your bayonet or whatever you may have been cooking on your fire and literally eat that, or like you said, the coffee. They're drinking coffee as they're marching into a cornfield to fight. So there's some, I think, some determination there on either side. My favorite coffee story at Antietam, though, is one of our presidents actually was, I don't want to say a glorified coffee runner, but that's exactly what he was. And there's a monument dedicated to him there, and it talks about him running coffee to orderlies. And then he becomes the president of the United States. And for those that may not know, that's William McKinley. But just,
Yeah, how do you get designated a coffee carrier?
that's a great question.
And is there such thing as a coffee cooler? Because a coffee cooler was somebody who didn't show
Right.
up, right? It was in the back lines.
So there are a number of things. You could just be attached as an adjutant to another general, and that was the assignment you were given. Or I'm not quite sure exactly what led McKinley to have the duty of running coffee in the middle of a heated engagement, but he sure did. And again, you think in September of 1862, he's running coffee, but you look in turn of the 1800s, he's president. So I always thought that was just kind of fascinating there.
Well, you just, that's one of the things that's so interesting about history and about human beings, is the weaving of where somebody is at one point and where they end up, 30, 40 years
Mhm.
later. And, sometimes you're really surprised. McKinley is certainly who's surprising,
Agreed.
but wasn't Garfield also on that battlefield? Am I wrong about that?
He was so he was in the Western Theater of the Civil War. So he didn't make it to Antietam. He was at Stones River, or Murfreesboro, depending on where you're from, and he was also at Chickamauga, which was I think, a pretty impactful moment on his entire life.
Mhm.
And in Stones River, I don't mean to get graphic with it, but he experiences, excuse me, something horrific, and Rosecrance's aide actually is hit in the head with a shell. And Rosecrans, who's the commander of the Union forces in Stones River at that battle, is almost instantly pulling Garfield as an aide. So you can imagine, like, you're coming in to replace a guy that, I mean, killed on the field of battle, but probably a little too close to the fight than they should be. So
Yeah.
he's probably wondering in his head, like, why am I what's going to happen to me if I have to stand near this guy? That incident traumatized Rosecrans forever, and I think that plays into a lot of his issues at Chickamauga. But Garfield really is his backbone there. Even though Rosecrans isn't successful, he's got Garfield backing him up there and really kind of being the spine that he needed, that I don't think Rosecrans actually had. Garfield's one of my
I didn't
favorites,
realize.
by the way, so I'm glad you brought him up.
Yeah, Garfield's great. I didn't realize Garfield had been that close to Rosecrans.
Yeah, Chickamauga especially. And Rosecrans is another interesting study if you ever get a chance. What an interesting guy.
Well, you take that big a cross section of the population, you're gonna get a lot of interesting folks, and then the funny thing about it is, and one of the things I think about a lot, with the Civil War and with so many things like that is, and I think about it because of Joshua
Hmm.
Chamberlain, like, what do you do when you have saved the country when you're 22? Like, how do you go back home and settle down as a farmer, or or stocking the shelves
Hmm.
in a store. And we actually, that trip we were on in Virginia, we actually ended up not ended up, we actually went through Appomattox, which, you just did a shout out to the National Park
Mhm.
Service. I have to say, I have never met a National Park Service person who wasn't
Right.
fabulous, just absolutely fabulous. But, they were talking, the guy that we talked to there was talking about a man from Appomattox who, his father had a plantation there at
Mhm.
Appomattox, and that legend has it this guy led the last charge of at Appomattox from his father's front yard, basically. And after the war, he ends up marrying the stepdaughter of McLean, who was
Mhm.
they signed the treaty in his front yard,
Right.
Wilmer McLean, and
Mhm.
they settle down for like 2 years, and they have a baby, and then he disappears. And they
Hmm.
find they we know what happened to him. He changed his name and he joined, Custer's 7th Cavalry. He joined the 7th Cavalry with Custer,
Oh my
who had
gosh.
been in Appomattox.
Mhm.
He could go fight the Indian Wars. And, I said something to my husband, something like, well, he just couldn't settle down in the middle of nowhere after fighting the war. He had repeatedly reenlisted, been wounded and reenlisted in the Confederate
Mm.
Army. And he actually died at the Battle of Washita. And, there weren't that many people who died there. He was one of them. And I said to my husband, he just couldn't settle down. And my husband said, actually, it seems more like he engaged in slow suicide. And,
Hmm.
I can see it. Like, how, after doing everything he had done by the time he was in his early 20s, was he going to settle down in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia? Um,
Probably not. And I got to do a stint down there. So what I do at the bookstore up in Manassas, I actually helped cover down at that store for a while. And I happened to do it during the anniversary of the surrender itself, which was just an incredibly powerful thing to be there for. And it wasn't, it was during the week, so there wasn't the fanfare of the reenactors and all that. Which it's great to see that, but there's something about the solemnity of just being there, and it's quiet, because you can be with your thoughts, and you can really kind of, again, feel that power of place. Even though the building wasn't, it's a reconstructed, kind of a fabrication of what the original house would have looked like. Uh, it was something I really can't explain, and you just kind of have to be there to feel that. But McLean, McLean tie from Manassas is crazy too. That it's legendized. Like, it has a lot of lure to it, but there is some truth rooted in that. McLean was at Manassas, not fighting but living close by near Blackburn's Ford, right? And he has a shell pass through a kitchen, whether that was an outhouse or the inside of the house. Typically, kitchens were outside at that time, so they weren't actually inside of a home. But it was enough to root him down to Appomattox, where he wanted to be away from the fighting, or he considered he would be far enough removed. Little did he know, of course, that they're going to surrender in his parlor.
Well, and so much of it is about place. You
Hmm.
know, it may not be the same buildings, although they're in the same places, but to look up at the hills and to see where the different units were coming, it's just different to be able to see them. I can't recommend that people go see battlefields. And the other thing that jumped out to me at Antietam, but also we did Yorktown, was the
Hmm.
degree to which you can still see in the land the places where the soldiers were entrenched.
Correct.
And especially at Yorktown, I just couldn't believe that you could still look at that land and say, "Oh yeah, here they were," because you can see the
Hmm.
trenches. It just blew me
And
away.
I might be spoiled by that, because again, the four battlefields here, Fredericksburg doesn't necessarily have the entrenched fighting that you think about, but Chancellorsville, Wilderness, and Spotsylvania, they do. And they have that because the soldiers realize, like at Antietam, where they're moving through cornfields and they're moving into sunken roads and open fields, they do this over and over again, and realize that maybe digging trenches isn't as cowardly as we thought. A lot of the officers from West Point, and maybe officers that were appointed, had this notion that it wasn't manly or it wasn't courageous to dig a ditch and stay in that. But when you have such a shock and human life being just wasted the way it was, the preservation to that is obviously to dig and entrench, right? So later in the war, 63, 64, 65, that's the method of fighting that they're going to. So you see these intricate works. And Spotsylvania, you have an instance where they're fighting for 22 straight hours hand to hand in a trench. And they've it's progressed. It's gotten hateful. They're really hateful, and they're fighting over these really tiny pieces of ground versus this expansive Antietam, or Manassas. It's gone to a point where they're digging in and they're fighting in very concentrated areas, and the fighting's more intense. And I think with the digging came the intensity, because now it's a whole different type of warfare. But I think it spoke volumes too on just how the country was in the 1860s. Of course, it was a lead up to that. It wasn't just a one big flashpoint and boom, we have a civil war. There was so much going into it to cause that. But I think in 1864, and trenches in my mind always bring up that it got really nasty towards the end, and the only way to preserve that life was to dig a trench.
Well, and the other thing that's so interesting about what you're saying and about that part of the war is the degree to which the Civil War really made people understand the differences in technology and how that changed
Mhm.
warfare. And one of the things that really jumped out to me, I think it was last summer, when the Ukrainians put the drones inside
Mhm.
the roof of the fabricated homes and had them delivered on trucks very close to a Russian airfield, and then let the drones out, and they destroyed the everything on the airfield.
Mhm.
I went live that day for some other reason, and I said, "This is a game changer. This is a game
Yeah.
changer in war." And a lot of people were like, "It's just drones. We've had drones before. What are you talking about?" And anybody who had studied the American Civil War knew that once you had that dramatic a change in technology, you were gonna see a change across the world in terms of technology.
Mhm.
And now we're sitting here watching Ukraine having turned the tide, not only in Russia with its use of drones there, but also all countries around the world, including the United States of America, going to Ukraine hat in hand and going, "Hey, wait a minute, those drones,
Yep.
can we talk about those drones?" But then you think about what that's going to do to the American way of war, and the fact that, now we spend more than the next 10 countries combined in the amount of money we spend on our munitions, and things like this whole new fleet of battle cruisers that the president wants to put
Mhm.
into operation. I think there are 43 of them. People are already saying they're white elephants, that they're, now that we have drone warfare, that's not how we're going to be doing war any longer. And that's just really interesting if you think about what that's going to mean, both for strategy and for how you deploy people, but also for economies. Just funny how the few changes like rifled
Right.
artillery or rifles, which, nowadays we're like, "Oh, yeah, that's just what they are." But you think of how dramatically that changed everything about warfare during the Civil War. And now, and artillery and knowing how to use artillery. Now watching in our moment drones and how incredibly cheap they
Mhm.
are taking over the global stage. We just can't begin to imagine what it's gonna do.
No, you're right, and I think that's a parallel I didn't even think to draw. Like, yeah, the Civil War does do that. Maybe not revolutionized, but in a way it does. Like, you're bringing new technology and you're using antiquated tactics. Now, I don't fault any of the officers for using those antiquated tactics, because at West Point, the book of the day was the Napoleonic warfare. Like, you're learning how to fight how Napoleon fought, but you're using advanced weaponry for their time with outdated tactics. That doesn't work. So you have to evolve that as you're going. And I think, when you were mentioning that, one of my immediate thoughts was that's self-preservation on the Ukrainian side. They're experimenting with new ways to preserve themselves, because they are under attack. They are, I mean, mercifully under attack. So the fact that they're able to evolve and use drones, it may sound small, but you're onto something there with that. I think that might be one of the most pivotal moments of our time when it comes to warfare, is seeing how many people are flocking to the Ukraine to get these drones too, or advisors, like, how do we use these? How do we implement these?
They're
Yeah, they're cheap.
You know, if
Those
if you
battleships
if
aren't.
you can use $1,000 drone to take out a battleship,
Hmm.
I mean, it's a real game changer. And certainly the Civil War and its use of technology, again, at the beginning of the war, it made total sense to have those, big charges because that's how people had done it. But
Right.
by the end of the war, as you say, people were digging in and trying to avoid the artillery and the rifles. And it's a whole different game. One of the jokes that my advisor used to make was that one of the reasons Grant was such an innovator was because he'd been such a poor student, that he hadn't actually read the books he was supposed to read. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but he hadn't read the books he was supposed to read at West Point. So he did what made sense.
Mhm. So Walt Young here, who is he's actually a part of the Unfiltered crew. He comes on with us every now and then. He's down at Fort Sumter in Charleston. So we're talking about first in the Civil War.
Walt,
Yeah,
nice.
Walt's got a great gig. He said mismatch between revolution in killing technology and lagging medical knowledge, still a decade away from realized germ theory, recipe for a lot of horror. He's absolutely right. Um, the medical aspect of the Civil War is a horror book in itself. To just see how, I don't want to say again antiquated, because to them that was modern revolution. They're using things like ether, and they're using different types of chemicals to try to subdue patients so that they're not screaming and having a horrible time. Amputation was so rampant, you had to find some type of way, whether it be morphine, again, ether, or any of these other type of drugs that they're introducing. So I like to talk about, there's another new thing. You're looking at embalming. That's a big thing that comes out of the Civil War, and it's almost devilish because you've got morticians standing in. We'll use Fredericksburg when the pontoon bridges are set up and the federal forces are moving across those pontoon bridges. There's a mortician with basically business cards saying, "Hey, if you put this in your pocket and I find you dead on the field, as long as your family pays for it, I'll embalm you and you'll look nice and clean and fresh for your family once you fall on the field of battle." And the morale just plummets when you see somebody like, "You're gonna die. Here's my business card."
So I'm laughing because this has come up twice this week in my
Really?
life, and I don't think it's ever come up before, but somebody asked. It was a weird thing. We got talking about chairs for an event in my town, and
Mhm.
I said, "Well, do you know why we have folding chairs? Do you know where we got
I
folding
don't,
chairs?"
but I'm intrigued.
You can figure it out. It's the same reason that they are called funeral parlors, and that's that once funeral services moved out of people's homes, out of the front
Mhm.
parlor, the people who had funeral homes called them funeral parlors to evoke the idea that you were in a
Okay.
parlor, and then you needed to have folding chairs. Unlike in a church where you had pews, you needed folding chairs, and it was a funeral director who invented folding chairs for funerals. And so that then the person turned to me and said, "Well, when did they invent embalming?" And I'm like, "Civil
That's
War,"
right.
or at least not invented. Obviously, the ancient societies had it
Sure.
too, but it really became popular in the U.S. during the Civil War. But one of the reasons they had to amputate so many arms and legs, especially, was because of the fabric that would get in when you go through fabric, and the fabric
Mhm.
would get caught in the wound, and that's what created the infection.
That's right.
And I did a deep dive once on wounds in the Civil War. And you know what I thought was most interesting about it was that, in fact, the Confederate wounds often healed more quickly than Union wounds under one circumstance. Do you know what that
I
was?
don't. I wanna say it's probably, is it the material in there? It
Yeah.
was? Okay.
No, the reason for it was that the Union soldiers, if they had something to sew up, as opposed to just
Mhm.
cutting off, if they were sewing it up, they used cotton, and cotton would, have bacteria in
Sure.
it, and was always infected. But the Confederacy, in many places, was so short of cotton fiber that they used horsehair, and the only way you could get horsehair soft enough to stitch with it was to soak it in ink water, so it had fewer germs in it.
Oh, yeah, boiling it out. Look at
Boiling
that.
it out. Yeah.
That makes sense. I did not know that. See, I'm learning new stuff today too. I love it. The Civil War is something I don't think I'll ever stop. I don't think any of us will stop learning from, because there's just so much to that part of our history that it's a constant learning experience for all of us, and I love that about it. Like, I feel like every time I pick up a Civil War book, there's at least one new thing I can take away from it if I haven't learned anything from it before.
Do
Um,
you know the book Gone for a Soldier?
I've
Um,
this, you know what? That's the second time I've heard that this week.
so
That's funny.
that's a cool one because the guy illustrated a lot of it.
Hmm.
Um, he's not a fine artist, but he talks about the things he has seen, and he's in a lot of different positions in the army, and he illustrated it. So it's a really cool book to get your hands on. And there our copy. I bought a copy within the last 10 years online for a
Okay,
reasonable sum of money, like $20.
sweet. I'll have to check on Gone for a Soldier. I know I've heard
It
that
was
twice now. I don't know if it was recommended at the store or not. I always go to Hardtack and Coffee. That's one of my like all time go tos because Billings does a great job of being honest with his life there and some of the glamorous parts of it and some of the not so glamorous parts of the war. But I think he does a great job of covering that too. So,
well, the guy in Gone for a Soldier, actually, some of what he does, he is an orderly, so he's got pictures of the operating rooms, illustrations of the operating rooms. But he also, at one point, is on the detail that is assigned to guard the houses of prostitution to keep the
mm,
generals out. So he
yeah.
actually writes about that, which is sort of interesting.
It's like the early version of an MP in World War II, keeping them away
Right,
from all the French houses, right?
exactly.
Question for you about your trips: if you could pick any of the sites you visited in Virginia, did you have one that spoke to you more than the others? Not that they're all, there's one better than the other, but was there one that you just felt really drawn to and that you had a really powerful takeaway from?
Well, there was none that was not that
That's
way.
good.
Let me give you a list here. Antietam, of
Hmm.
course. Jamestown Rediscovery,
Awesome place.
because yes, and because of the fact that the people in Jamestown came and then left, and when they went to leave, they threw everything there, so you can really recreate exactly who was there and what they were wearing and everything else. I thought that was sort of mind-boggling. And the room where James Madison wrote the Virginia Plan for the Constitution, um,
There at Montpelier.
that was interesting. That was really, yeah, that was Montpelier. I'm
There you
sorry.
go.
That was interesting to me because as a writer, you get it. You get
Hmm.
the feel of that room and what, and being isolated in that room, which is a bit off from the rest of the house. It's upstairs.
Hmm.
It's got a big picture window through which he is looking at enslaved people working in the tobacco
That's right.
fields. But it's got the sort of a writerly feel to it, and that I found incredibly powerful. I liked Yorktown. It surprised me how much I liked Yorktown because I understood exactly how, when you read in a book, you don't really get a lot of
No,
that
you're
stuff.
right.
The fact that the British are caught in between the French ships and the colonial army. You get it more when you're
Oh, you
there.
can visualize
Um,
that easy up there. Oh my gosh, yeah. Especially if you're where the readouts are, and you can see where the York River is. You can see the fields and all the trenches that were dug, and you can see how close you are to the British lines. And the British are also in the town. And if you're standing up on Redoubt 10, and it's a winter day at least, when the foliage is kind of lessened, you can see into the town. I mean, you're not far away at all. Cornwallis must have been really nervous looking up at a American flag on that readout versus the naval jack that was there. I can only
yeah.
imagine.
No, it again, the fact that those trenches are all still
Mhm.
there, the town is still there, and then the water's right there. You get just how squeezed they
Yeah.
were and how they really didn't have any options. And that, you just think about the history of that turning on a dime where, they've got the naval battle and the British ships leave and go for repairs. Like, "Toodaloo,
Yeah.
folks." It's like,
And the
"Wait,
French come in.
wait, you're gonna lose the war." Yeah, right.
Now, when you were at Montpelier, did you get to see or hear maybe I don't know if one of the guides may have told you or not, but the bricks? Did you hear some of the fact that there are still enslaved fingerprints in some of the bricks?
I took pictures of them.
Good.
I have patterns. I love patterns. So I actually took a lot of
Mhm.
bricks. And the other at a lot of pictures of bricks at Yorktown. There was
Mhm.
something I had never seen before in terms of bricks, and that is an entire wall where all of the bricks were laid end to end, as opposed to often you get a course that is horizontal and then some going the other way to
Right.
create a double wall. These were all butt end frontward, which I thought
Cool.
was yeah, I took pictures of it. I'll send them to you if you want.
Yeah, please do because I want to go find the house next time I'm down there.
This
I
was a
go
this
once
is
or
not a
twice a
house,
year.
it was a wall,
It was a
but it
wall. Okay.
it was beautiful, and it was right there in the town.
Definitely go see that then. Montpelier, I'm not too far away from that myself, and that's one that I visit frequently for obvious the same reason you were there. That room is the I love all the other rooms in the house, but there's something about being in that room. I mean, even
in
though
that
the
room.
Vanderbilt, not the Vanderbilts, the DuPonts, they had their version of the house, but the fact that they were able to recreate that room and most of it still being original in there, minus the books, but the books are what sell me too when I'm in there because it's almost a replica of what Madison's library would have been like. And as I see the bookshelf behind you too, which is great. We're all book lovers in this, so to also know that he used those to help formulate a lot of his mind and his writing in the Virginia Constitution there. Um,
So, but that's an important distinction, I think, because a lot of the books that he would have had and that were, the replicas they're the
mhm,
replacements that were there were about sort of the philosophy of
mhm.
governance, which is fascinating. But mine are all, I don't know if you can see them, mine are all actual 19th century political
No
biographies or
kidding.
political. So there, yeah, I collect them. So this is Carl Schurz. This is Mrs. James G. Blaine. This is Charles Lindbergh. That's 20th century. Julia Ward Howe.
Oh wow.
They're all, yeah, they're all 19th century, and they're sort of where I do my research as opposed to thinking great thoughts.
Right. So with great thoughts, pivoting a little bit, if that's okay. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about letters from an American, if you're okay with that. That
Sure.
so I,
That's
that's
there.
right. Oh, awesome. I'm glad you have that documented
Yes,
too.
there's this wonderful man out in Washington who prints them up for me. And I think I'm missing some here, but I think we're up to volume 14.
Oh my gosh, that is so cool.
Yeah.
That has been a serious beacon for myself, and I'm sure I'm speaking for others as well. But I worked on the Hill for a long time, and I worked conveniently 2016 to 2021. Yeah, conveniently, right? So I saw a lot of stuff, and I was a legislative correspondent. So a lot of what I did was just take your regular junk mail to members, but I also took some serious stuff that I probably don't even know what I took. Honestly, some stuff I have no idea. But I delivered to the leadership of the House. So I got to meet some really interesting people, and one of the things that I remember most was COVID. And I want to say that there's actually a sort of a silver lining to my COVID memory because I had to still commute and do these mail runs for them, but there was not a soul in the U.S. Capitol. So
That's so weird.
it was bizarre. But at the same time, as a historian, that was one of the most, oh, I don't even know what the word would be for this, surreal moments that I've ever had, or weeks or months, because I could have my lunch break and the rotunda was quiet. There was not a soul walking around. If I wanted to go walk into the old Supreme Court chamber, I could go in there and just try to envision the Dred Scott case happening. And or my favorite thing to do is the Civil War battlefields are great, but I love the little details that we don't talk about a lot, like just the day to day life of a soldier. Elmer Ellsworth's fire swabs were in an unfinished Capitol doing acrobatics from some of the different rafters that were in the rotunda. The Ways and Means Committee room was Ellsworth's office when he was
Oh,
stationed
wow.
in the Capitol. So, like, having that access there, it was just this building that I just loved. Um, and there were some dark days, obviously, in 2021 there. So reading letters from an American brought a lot of that out for me to remember that, hey, yes, your memories of this place were sort of tainted with a very bad day. Um, but having that hope from what you provided in your letters there, and being able to draw parallels through history and modern day, I use that a lot just to kind of keep going. Ultimately until like spring or summer of 21 when I finally called it quits up there. But it was very impactful for me. So like my first question to you is what started Letters from an American? Was it just a wake up moment, like, you know what, I need to do this, or was there something that really sparked that?
No, and I think the way it started is really indicative of what the letters really are. That is, I did not start them. I was moving, and I was, I had a full-time job that I
Hmm.
loved, and I was writing a book, and, um, but I've been a teacher for 30 years, and so what happened was that, I had been writing on Facebook, to about 22,000 people for a long
Hmm.
time, about 5 years, and I'd write every month or every week or so, and it would be an essay or a something, and it wasn't necessarily about
Right.
history, it was about just something that was on my mind. And I hadn't written in 2019, I hadn't written since July 18th.
Okay.
That date stuck in my mind for some reason. And I had been, because we've been moving and, everything that was going on in life, the book and all that. And people were starting to worry about me because I had had issues in the past with getting in the wrong side of political people who didn't like what I was
Right.
writing over stupid
Oh, I'm
stuff.
sure.
And so people were like writing and saying, "Are you okay? Have you been silenced?" And I just was too busy to write. So then on September 15th,
Mhm.
2019, I was leaving where I was living to move here, I think. And I had to paint the um, area around the windows on the outside of the
Mhm.
house. And it was September, and I asked my brother-in-law to come over and watch because I was gonna need to be on a ladder, and he couldn't do it
Right.
himself or help because he is just unable to do that. So, but I didn't wanna be on a ladder without somebody there to watch
Right.
me, and just out of being cautious. And so as somebody comes to talk to the 2 of us. I come on the ladder, and I go to talk to them, and a yellow jacket comes over and stings
Oh,
me
no.
right there. There's still a mark from it. It's a friend of mine's. I don't know if I can swear on this podcast, but
Yes,
a
you
friend
can. You're good.
friend of mine says, "Well, yellow jackets, they're all just assholes in the fall," and that's really true, right? But I'm allergic to yellow jackets.
Oh,
And so my brother-in-law, remember, I was not living in that house anymore. I was
right.
moving out, and we're about a couple miles away. And I turned to my brother-in-law and I said, "Oh, Chris, you're not going to want to hear this. I've been stung by a yellow jacket." And he starts to run to the house and said, "I'll get your EpiPen." And I was like, "Oh, Chris, you're really not going to want to hear this." And he goes, "It's at the other house. Oh my God, I'll go get it." And I was like, "Oh, Chris, you're really not going to want to hear this." And he turns around, I can still see him, and he goes, "You don't have an EpiPen, do you?" And I said, "Just I never got around to getting one this year." And he goes, "If you don't die, I'm going to kill you." So so I was supposed to drive back to Boston, but I didn't dare get on the road
Right.
until I knew how bad my reaction would be. We live really in the middle of nowhere. So I thought, well, as long as I'm just sitting here swelling, I might as well write on Facebook. And because people are wondering about me. So I sat down on September 15th and I wrote I said, "I'm sorry I haven't been here, but this is what the world looks like me today. It looks like today to me." And I mentioned that then chair of the House Intelligence Committee,
I
Adam
remember.
Schiff, a Democrat of
Mhm.
California, had written a letter to then acting director of national intelligence saying, "I know that there has been a whistleblower complaint about somebody, and you by law had to give it to me by such and such a date, and you haven't done that. So we assume it's somebody a principal in the White House."
Right.
So paraphrase. So I wrote this thing, decided I could drive to Boston to go to work the next day, hit send. And by the time I got to Boston, I had thousands and thousands of emails and messages with people asking more about what had happened. So the next night, I'm like, well, no one wants to hear from me twice in a row. So I didn't write on the 16th, but I wrote on the 17th, just answering the questions that people had asked. And that's how it started. I've written every night since, but
That's awesome.
it's not really that I'm doing 2 things. 1, I'm answering people's questions,
Mhm.
but 2, I'm trying to keep a record for historians in 150 years of what seems to be moving the needle in American life nowadays, because that's what historians do, right?
That's right.
We based in the facts, but what we're really trying to do is identify the levers that are changing society. So it's become sort of this twofold thing. And now plus it's kind of a challenge to make sure I can do it every night. But that's where it started. And because it comes from a position of being a teacher and answering questions and not from I'm not a media
Right.
company, I'm not any of those. It's got a really different feel, I think, than a lot of people doing similar things.
No, it does, and it definitely resonates because I have my own questions. I can watch news all day, but I'm a reader. I like to. I wish I still had a newspaper subscription. I mean, I would wake up and read the newspaper extra early if I could, but that's how I like to kind of invest my time in current events is to read. So, what you provided there, and you mentioned too that this is a record. I love that, and I think as historians we recognize that there is now a record of what is happening right now in our country, and to be able to have that to hold on to and maybe make some sense of this because it's crazy to try to digest everything every single day. You know, I mean, there's so many things that I don't even know how to phrase it. It's just crazy to try to divulge all that. And I think you really help break
Well,
it down.
and there's an awful lot right now coming over the transom. So actually, I've already written tonight's
Okay.
letter because I knew I was going to be doing this, and I, there's a really nice story
Hmm.
in it. I mean, by nice, I mean as a writer, there's a pattern to what I was going to do. But then there were so many other things that happened today. I had to try and find a way to shoehorn them in. I don't know if it works or not, but we've just got so much coming at us all the time. And like so we're recording this on May
Yeah.
27th. Over the weekend, there was a huge deal at Delaney Hall in New Jersey, and I had written about Delaney Hall, which is a 1,000 bed detention center run, which is a private, back in February of 2025, and then later on in May
Hmm.
of 2025, when there was a big fight over it opening at all. And then I had forgotten I knew anything about it. And all of a sudden it's back in the news. And there are a number of things that actually reminds me a lot of a diary like um, the Mary Chestnut's diary,
Hmm.
when she was writing about the American South during the Civil War. There are stories that come back, and one of the things that we have not done yet, but that I think is going to be really interesting when we do it, and we will, is indexing the last. We're almost at 7 years now of these letters, and there are a lot of people that didn't seem like they were going to be important, and they're coming back again,
Right.
or that seemed like they were going to be really important and fell off the face of the earth. And it's going to be interesting to see who comes back and how the story comes out. So one of the things that I wrote about last night was the fact that in Tennessee, a federal judge um, uh, dismissed the federal criminal charges against Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Well, he
Hmm.
hasn't been in the news now for 6 months or more. He's the guy that got sent to El Salvador
Right.
by accident. So it's going to be interesting, I think, and perhaps giving a different perspective to people of what actually happened. Because like some of the characters that I did not think were going to be important came back and they ended up being pretty important. So we'll see. And I think
Yeah.
you can see the same thing with Mary Chestnut. She ended up saying she was going to turn it into a novel because so many people kept reappearing and there were stories to be told there. I'm never going to turn this into a novel, but I do
No.
think that people have their own stories in it.
Yeah. And do you have plans to publish these as a set or as like maybe a hardcover collector, for anyone, or just kind of having it accessible on Substack the way it is?
So many people have asked for it. We
Hmm.
probably will do a limited edition for a few people, but let's be honest. Some of them are the best work I've ever done. I'm incredibly proud of them. But a
Hmm.
lot of them are not going to be of general interest.
Right.
And so I can see someday there's two books I'd like to write based on them. One is that I actually now have a pretty large body of letters that are specific to historical events that happened on a certain day.
Right.
And I think that would be a fun book to have.
Heck
If
yeah.
you'd have to fill it out so you had all 365 of them. We might do that, or we might do a collection of the really spectacular letters. And what's funny is everybody thinks they're all that good. They're not. There are a few really good ones, and I'm glad that people think they're all that good. They're really not. A
Hmm.
lot of them are really dismissible. So we'll probably do that, but what we will do is, find a way to make them easily accessible to researchers for free. They will always be free, and in order to do that, we gotta take the time to index them because right now they're
Right.
just not useful unless you're looking for a day. But
Mhm.
if you're looking again for somebody who you didn't expect to have show up and then who does repeatedly, in that case, you really need that index.
Absolutely. No, like I said, they are absolutely invaluable. Do you have I want to say a favorite letter because they all mean so much and they change throughout what's happening currently. But do you have one that you remember that was just one that really felt like you needed to write it that day and kind of maybe focused on one topic? Is there one that you remember?
Yes,
Yeah.
there's one that really surprised me. So the most powerful one, I think, is the one I usually run for Memorial Day
Okay.
about, um, Bo Bryant, who was the brother of so I grew up in a really small town, and if you've come from a
Mhm.
small town, you know that you're in and out of each other's houses and that you call a lot of people aunt and uncle and actually sort of have duplicate parents. And my parents
Mhm.
were lovely, wonderful people, but I was also reared by a couple that I called Mama and Papa and grew up with their son who was like a brother to me. And Helen's Mama's brother, um, his real name was Floyston, but he was known as Bo,
Mhm.
and he died in World War II. And I wrote a piece about him and who he was from the perspective of somebody who could never know him, and what it was like to have that sort of a hole ripped in the fabric of our town. And I think that piece stands the test of time. That's a great piece. Then there are other ones that the one I wrote for the Gettysburg Address has stood the test of time. Usually it's historical, but the one
Yeah.
that surprises me, the most popular thing I believe that I've ever written is one that I wrote standing at the stove while I was cooking supper.
No
And
kidding.
I wrote it's for March 15th, which is the anniversary of, Maine becoming a state.
Okay.
And I just wrote about how I became a historian and how that reflected the agency of people in the 1850s reclaiming their country. And I just whipped it off. It didn't get edited, it didn't get anything. I just whipped it off, and that remains, I believe, the most popular thing I've ever written
And
for
that's
the
awesome.
letters.
So and it's almost like your story. I think that definitely deserves to be probably the most popular because you're telling about yourself, and maybe not an introductory, of course, but that's your story, and you're
Well,
doing. That's
well,
awesome.
what's funny about it is that I mentioned that it starts with a joke, and this man that he was my age, actually he's a man now, taught me to use a chainsaw. We were kids and we grew up together, again, small town. And he always used to joke um, on March 15th, the day of Maine's statehood. Um, Beware cedar, or cedar, beware the ads of March, um, because an adze is a wood tool. And
Okay.
so I started with that joke. And the funny part about it was that he and I had lost touch. And I got a letter from him on one March 16th. And he said, I was checking in to see what you're doing with your life. And here I am in your letter. So
Isn't it funny how that works?
yeah.
That's awesome. So I know we're coming up on the 45, a little over 45 minutes, but I'm okay with hanging out for a minute. Um, if you could go back and start, do you think you started at the right time to write these, or do you think there is an earlier time that you would have started? If you
That's
had to, if you could go back, I know it's such a cliche question, but like, if you could go back and pick a time to start, do you think you started at the right time to write these, or do you think there's an earlier time?
So I'm going to go all philosophical on you. I think
That's
I
fine.
did start at the right time because this is when the country demanded them,
Yeah.
literally demanded them of me. And a time when I was skillful enough to do it. That is, I am now, the letters have cost me an enormous amount, but they have given me something that is absolutely irreplaceable. And I'm talking about me personally.
Correct.
And that is that I was a decent writer. I think I had 6 books out, maybe 5 or something, with good presses when I
Mhm.
started writing the letters. Um, but I was a decent writer. I am now a good writer. And I got that because of the letters, because of the discipline of sitting
Mhm.
down every night and writing probably an average of 1,500 to 2,000 words. And I was not skilled enough to do that earlier in my career. I wouldn't have been able to do this. And I grew with the letters. So I remember somebody saying to me, well, we really need you to, because at first I only covered the Ukraine scandal and Trump and his connections to the
Mhm.
Russian operatives. And somebody said, we need someone to cover all of America. And I said, oh, that's impossible. Nobody could do that. And of course, now that's what I do. And under Biden, I covered foreign affairs as well, because that was
Mhm.
his big thing. It's a little simpler under Trump in that he's got a clear public persona, and what he's doing privately, we just don't have a window into because they've got that, they've really got that pretty obscure.
Yeah.
But I remember one of the people who was really a mentor to me was Bill Moyers. And I got to know him because I had written a piece after Trump got elected. Charlie Kirk actually put me on the professor watch list, one of the very first things, which I took enormous personal offense to because nobody has ever complained about my teaching. I don't do politics in the classroom at
Right.
all, refuse to do it, and so on. But I wrote a response, and that went viral, and Bill picked it up and into what his magazine was, and so on. But anyway, I remember talking to him the first time we ever talked on the phone and saying, I can't do this. I can't keep doing this. This is taking too much time. It's too much. I can't take the pressure. I can't do this. And him sort of talking me through it and watching now where I am, looking back at that first conversation, less than a year into him, I'm just a really different person now than I was. And I don't think I could have done it earlier than that. And I don't think necessarily the country needed it before that.
Yeah.
I think I came along when I was needed, and I will disappear when I am no longer needed. Again, this seems to me very clearly to be part of a certain moment in American
Hmm.
history. I'm very aware of the fact that I am playing a role in this moment, but I am not here
Right.
forever. When people don't need me any longer, I will no longer be here.
No, but I do think that's a fantastic way to put it. Is yeah, you were needed for this time because how does one make sense of what's happening in all avenues of this country, and that and the history comes along with it too. Like I think one thing you've helped me do is try to be a little more brave with some maybe my family or friends that think a little differently than I do, a lot differently than I do. Let's face it, it's not little. Um, but even when it comes to the Civil War, like I still have plenty of family that will until I'm blue in the face, try to convince me that there is no way, in no way, shape, or form, slavery took any form of a cause for the Confederacy because we're just good Southern people. And I mean, I've had to find ways to try to approach that, and it used to be pretty aggressive, but you lay out facts and you do it in such an eloquent way that I've taken from that and trying to use that in my own life with some of my family members, like maybe you should read their own words or maybe and bring the cornerstone speech, which is a very very simple one to use, but you can go much more in depth than just that. But the way you've taken the letters and how you've presented those to folks is an inspiration to a lot. And I think the discipline too, like I wanted to thank you for that. I actually started writing on Substack myself just recently.
Oh,
Now
cool.
I think when I met you, I talked to you about, I got into fiction writing and had no idea that that was going to be what I wanted to do because I'm a historian by trade. So obviously I want to write like a good academic piece at some point. I've got 6 short stories that I never thought I had in me in a
Oh,
novel out now.
cool.
So, I mean,
Do
the
you mind
writing,
do you mind
go ahead.
saying what the title of it is? What the title of your Substack is?
Yep, it's short stories and ramblings, and other ramblings, excuse me. And so a lot of it, it's not. I wanted to be a horror writer. It's not even just horror. There's some really good, just emotional stories. And I think in my life, I've had things happen lately, of course, too, that have really put me on a place where I need to reconsider my entire life. So the writing is where my outlet was, and a lot of that does come from you. So a big thank you for the
Oh,
letters from
that's
an American and being able to talk to you because I that helped me get in front of a computer and finally just start cranking out some words, and it's cathartic. But I think there's the stories aren't history, but they're reflections on where I'm at, and I never want to use exact circumstances or like stories like that, but I've been able to just speak through that. And so again, I just wanted to make sure I gave you the proper things for that as well.
Well, so, I wrote a novel for fun once, and
Hmm.
one of the it is based in history, but it was a novel, and one of the things that I found that just blew me away, and I did a ton of research, but that blew me away was that when you write nonfiction, I mean, sorry, when you write fiction, you develop your characters, and then they start to behave on their own.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
What's going on here? I put
I
all these
just
people
spoke
in
to
a
a
room.
professor about that yesterday. Yes, they do.
Crazy. I had this woman, I couldn't tell why she was behaving the way she was. And then it turned out she had heart disease. And I was like, of course
Yeah.
she's going to die. But, I didn't know that when I wrote the
No,
character.
no, you didn't. And it's crazy. Like that happened. I did a short story, and it was a little bit of a horror one. But I had this idea of a guy discovering an old Appalachian secret, right? And then at the end of it, I'm like, he's collecting teeth. Why is he collecting teeth? And it from the original aspect where that had nothing to do with the story to being the conclusion of the story, I was like, just watching them grow. And I think the other thing is you get attached to those characters sometimes too, the good ones, anyways, maybe even the bad ones, because they're all quirky and they have their own characteristics, of course. But you get attached to them. And I don't know, just the experience of writing, and it's been crammed. I've been doing it about, almost daily, about a month and a half now. It makes me feel like an entirely different person. I don't know. I didn't know that was possible, but being able to like just let it out on a computer or on a keyboard.
Well, and for
It's
me, words mediate the world for me. I mean, people
yeah,
ask me how I can keep looking at the horrors I look at. And for me, the words help to put it into some sort of a structure so that I can deal with how to respond to it. Whereas if it's all just out there in a big mess, it's overwhelming.
it is. Agreed. Alrighty, we're coming up on 8:30. Did you have any last minute thoughts or anything you would like to say before we sign off here today?
Well, I want to thank you, first of
Of
all,
course.
and I want to thank NPS people. And I also want to call your attention and your listeners as
Hmm.
well to the new project. I think I told you when we were in
Hmm.
that we were working on this new project that we just started dropping 2 days ago for the 250th. They are 1 minute. Have you seen them? They're one
I
minute
have. I've been
videos.
reposting everyone I see, and
Aren't they
Pete
great?
Buttigieg was amazing on that. I love the Erie Canal story. That was I love him. Love them.
So those are really interesting, again, for people who care about public history and public
Hmm.
facing history, because let me tell you, doing the entire Erie Canal in 110 words, it's like it is the most difficult thing
Oh
I have
yeah.
ever done. And I'm not the only writer. We hired a whole bunch of writers, but we've actually had to drop, I think probably at this point, at least 7 scripts where we're like, it's too big. We just can't
Yeah.
do it in 110 words. It'll offend, will offend people, or we're missing stuff or whatever. So it's an interesting study of like how much can you cram into 110. We have a maximum. Our absolute top limit is 124
Okay.
words for any of the topics.
That's wow.
So it's been a fun project, but people should check that out because it's an attempt to make our history really accessible and to remind people that they can change what comes next. And that, I think, is sort of my gift to the country for the
No, we
250th.
need that too. Interesting. Next week, I have a gentleman coming on who has been researching celebrations throughout our history, and we're going to tie that into A250 next Wednesday. So I'm looking
That's
forward. Yeah,
cool.
it's such a unique topic too. And I messaged him today. I'm like, so what are we going to talk about? I never asked you what we're going to talk about. He said, well, I've been doing some research on celebrations and the way it impacts us historically. I'm like, perfect. That's perfect. Like I
That
need to
is great.
research some and like bring one to the table too that maybe he doesn't know or he does. But that's perfect. I love it when historians get together.
Well,
It's dangerous.
and yeah, we're
Yeah,
such nerds. It's like nerd
it
prom,
is.
right? But you think about it, we create our own
Mhm.
celebrations, which, people forget but there's no reason that we have to celebrate anything. So why do we pick the things we do? I love that.
I do too. Well, Heather, thank you again so much for taking the time to talk to us today here on the Unfiltered Historian. It has been an absolute privilege to have you, and thank you for what you do for everybody. I really appreciate that.
Well, real pleasure. Good luck
Thank
to you, and I hope we'll stay
you.
in
We
touch.
will. Alrighty. And for those watching at home, thank you guys so much for tuning in today, and we will see you guys on the next one.